The doors of Harlow General Hospital had never been forced open before. They were now. 6 military personnel in combat dress moved through the emergency entrance at 0612 hours on a Tuesday morning, boots hitting linoleum hard enough to make the charge nurse drop her clipboard. They weren't asking for directions. They weren't waiting to be checked in. The one leading them, a woman in a dark jacket with no visible rank but the kind of posture that made people step back, walked straight to the nurse's station and said 4 words that stopped every conversation in the department cold. "We need Nora Voss." The charge nurse looked up. "I'm sorry. She's been suspended. She doesn't work here right now." The woman in the jacket looked at her evenly. "We know. Where is she?" 3 days before any of that happened, Nora Voss had been sitting in the back row of a staff meeting she hadn't been invited to but attended anyway, because the agenda listed a trauma room restructure she had already filed 3 written objections against, and nobody had responded to a single one. She was 33 years old, average height, with dark circles that never fully disappeared and hands that stayed still, even when the rest of her didn't. She had worked night shifts at Harlow General for 2.5 years, which in ER terms was long enough to know every broken supply cart, every monitor that gave false readings in cold temperatures, and every doctor who covered their bad decisions with paperwork. She wore her hair pulled back the same way every shift. She kept a small notebook in her left pocket. She didn't socialize at the nurse's station or join the group dinner orders or participate in the kind of easy hospital camaraderie that most staff mistook for culture. People didn't dislike her. They just didn't think about her much. That, she had decided years ago, was fine. The meeting was held in the second-floor conference room and run by Dr. Marcus Finch, the department's new attending physician who had been brought in from a hospital group in Portland 8 months ago and had spent most of that time reorganizing things that didn't need reorganizing. He had the kind of confidence that came from never being in a room where he was the least qualified person present. He was 38, well-dressed even in scrubs, and he referred to nurses by their last names when he remembered them at all. "I want to walk everyone through the new trauma bay configuration," he said, pulling up a floor plan on the screen at the front of the room. "Maintenance starts Monday. We'll have the space fully operational within 2 weeks." Nora looked at the diagram. She had seen it before. It had been circulated by administration 2 weeks prior, which was when she'd submitted her first objection. The new layout moved the secondary equipment station to the far wall to open up floor space, which looked clean on paper. In practice, it meant that during any multi-patient event, the secondary cart would be physically blocked by the primary trauma bay the moment a second stretcher came through the door. She raised her hand. "Dr. Finch." He glanced at her the way some people glance at things they haven't decided yet whether to acknowledge. "Voss." "The secondary cart placement," she said. "In a mass casualty scenario with 2 simultaneous critical intakes, the bay geometry blocks access. You'd have staff going around or over a stretcher to get to the defibrillator or the crash cart." He smiled slightly. Not unkindly. The way someone smiles when they've decided a comment isn't worth engaging with seriously. "The flow study we ran puts average access time at under 15 seconds. Flow studies don't run with a second critical patient on the floor. A few people shifted in their seats. Nobody said anything." "Noted," Finch said, and moved to the next slide. Nora didn't push it. She wrote 3 words in her notebook, "secondary cart access," and underlined them twice. After the meeting, she went to the charge nurse, Paula Dreyer, who had run the ER night team for 11 years and was the closest thing to an ally Nora had in the building. Paula was standing in the hallway with a coffee she hadn't had time to drink, scanning the updated schedule. "He didn't listen," Nora said. Paula exhaled through her nose. "He listened. He just decided you were wrong." "I'm not wrong." "I know." Paula lowered her voice. "Submit it in writing again. Route it through patient safety this time, not just department." "I already did that twice." Paula looked at her for a moment. "Then do it a 3rd time and make sure it's dated." She paused. "Nora, I'm not telling you to stop. I'm telling you how to protect yourself." Nora filed the 3rd objection that night before her shift started. She documented the specific geometry problem, attached a hand-drawn diagram, and included the estimated response time impact based on the distances she had physically measured herself during a quiet period 3 nights earlier. She sent it to patient safety, to the department head, and to the hospital's risk management office. The automatic reply from risk management came back within 40 seconds. Your submission has been received and will be reviewed within 10 business days. She didn't hear back from anyone, but the restructure began Monday as scheduled. By Thursday, the secondary equipment station had been moved to the far wall. The new trauma bay layout was clean and open and looked exactly like the diagram. Staff who worked days said it felt more spacious. One of the other nurses mentioned that Dr. Finch had been complimented on the redesign by the department head. Nora worked nights and said nothing. On the following Saturday, 11 days after the meeting, a section of Interstate 84 outside Harlow collapsed into a multi-vehicle pileup involving a commercial truck, 2 passenger vans, and 4 other vehicles. It happened at 9:47 in the evening. The first call came into the ER at 9:52. Nora was 4 hours into her shift. The initial radio report said 7 injured. By the time the first ambulance arrived, that number had become 11, and the incident commander on scene was already calling it a mass casualty event. 2 patients arrived simultaneously through the trauma bay entrance. A man in his 40s with a chest wound serious enough that the paramedic riding with him had already called the outcome twice, and a teenage girl with a traumatic brain injury who was seizing on the gurney. Both stretchers came through the door within 40 seconds of each other. Nora was already moving. She had pulled the crash cart to the left bay before the first ambulance called in, positioning it based on where she knew it needed to be. She had also moved the secondary equipment station 6 inches off the wall, not far enough to be obvious, just far enough to give a body clearance around the corner of the primary bay without climbing over anything. Finch came in behind the second gurney. Who moved the cart? It needed to move, Nora said, and kept her hands on the chest trauma patient's IV line. He looked at her. She didn't look back. For the first 40 minutes, it was controlled chaos, the specific kind that functions because everyone does their job and doesn't slow down to argue. Nora worked the chest trauma patient alongside Dr. Siobhan Kearney, who covered evenings and was competent in a steady, methodical way that held up under pressure. The teenage girl was stabilized in the second bay by 2 of the day shift residents who had stayed over. 3 more patients came in from the crash site within the first hour, 2 of them critical. The department ran at full capacity and then passed it. At the 50-minute mark, the chest trauma patient, the man in his 40s, went into cardiac arrest. Dr. Kearney was across the room managing an airway emergency on a third patient who had just come in actively hemorrhaging. There was no other physician within immediate reach. 2 of the nurses nearest to the chest trauma bay were managing the teenage girl's post-seizure monitoring and a medication administration that couldn't be interrupted without causing a secondary crisis. Nora looked at the monitor. Then she looked at the man on the table. She made a decision in under 2 seconds. She started compressions, then called out clearly to the nearest tech for the defibrillator, directed the other available nurse to push epinephrine, and when the defibrillator arrived and the rhythm on the monitor told her what she already suspected, she called the charge for a shock and delivered it herself. The rhythm came back, not cleanly. It stuttered, and she had to make 2 additional medication calls before it stabilized, but it came back. The man's blood pressure returned to a range that was low, but no longer incompatible with life. By the time Dr. Kearney reached the bay 3 minutes later, the patient was intubated, on a drip, and holding. Kearney looked at the monitor, then at Nora. You ran this? He arrested. You were occupied. Who authorized the episequence? The monitor did, Nora said. I just followed it. Kearney stared at her for another second, then nodded once and went to the patient chart. The rest of the night ran for another 4 hours. By the time the last critical patient had been transferred to the ICU, it was nearly 3 in the morning. The ER was a wreck. Supply carts stripped, floors mopped twice, paperwork stacked in uneven piles at every station. The staff who remained stood around in the particular days that follows a sustained emergency, too wired to sit down and too exhausted to stay standing. Nora was at the nurse's station writing up her documentation when Finch walked in. He didn't look like a man who had just managed a mass casualty event. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was now enforcing it. He stopped in front of her station and put both hands flat on the counter. You administered a medication sequence and operated a defibrillator without physician authorization, he said. That's a protocol violation. Nora kept writing. The patient was in arrest. There are escalation procedures for that. The escalation procedure is to save the patient. Nora, his voice dropped, not to something warmer, but to something more deliberate. I'm not interested in debating outcome. What you did was outside your scope. I can't let that stand without documentation. She looked up at him then. You're going to write me up. I'm going to file an incident report, which is standard. He's alive. That's not the point. She held his gaze. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the monitor in Bay 2 cycling through its routine checks. Then what is the point, Dr. Finch? He straightened. The point is that we have a chain of command for a reason. You don't get to decide when it doesn't apply. She went back to her documentation. I'll read the report when it's filed. He left. Paula, who had been standing near the medication cabinet and heard the entire exchange, waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before she walked over and stood beside Nora without saying anything for a moment. He's going to push for suspension, Paula said quietly. I know. It's going to come from administration, probably by morning. I know that too. Paula looked at her notes. Was the patient really that close? Nora set down her pen. Another 90 seconds and we wouldn't have gotten him back. Paula nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. She went back to her station and Nora went back to her paperwork, and the ER hummed its quiet post-crisis hum, and nobody on the overnight staff said much at all. Well, the suspension notice arrived at 7:14 a.m., 40 minutes after Nora's shift officially ended. She was in the locker room when Paula came in with a printed copy of the administrative memo. It was formal and cold and used the phrase breach of established clinical protocol 3 times in 4 paragraphs. It cited Dr. Finch's incident report and a secondary review from the department head, who had apparently convened an emergency consult at 6 in the morning to authorize the action. Nora's hospital badge access would be suspended effective immediately. She was to vacate the premises and not return until further notice, pending a full clinical review. Paula handed her the memo and stood there. How long? Nora said. They didn't put a timeline. That's usually bad. Nora read through the memo once, folded it, and put it in her bag. She opened her locker, took out her personal items, the small notebook, a half-empty water bottle, a phone charger, and put them in her bag too. She closed the locker and took her badge off her lanyard and held it for a moment. She had done the same thing once before, a long time ago, with a different kind of ID, in a different kind of building, and for a completely different set of reasons. She remembered what that had felt like. She remembered deciding then that she was going to put herself somewhere she could do something useful and stay underneath whatever radar made it possible to keep doing it. She handed the badge to Paula. Tell me something, Paula said. And I'm asking because I've been watching you work for 2 years, and I still don't know the answer. You've always known things. The way you move in a trauma bay, the calls you make. It's not just nursing school. Where did that come from? Nora picked up her bag. I learned a long time ago that hesitation costs more than mistakes. Paula looked at her for a moment. That's not actually an answer. No, Nora said. It's not. She walked out of the locker room, down the hall, and through the same ER entrance she had walked through several hundred times before. The morning shift was coming on. She passed 2 nurses she recognized, who glanced at her bag and her civilian clothes and her absence of a badge and looked away. She passed the trauma bay, where the man from the crash site was still on a drip somewhere upstairs, still alive. She pushed through the exit door. The air outside was cold and damp, a low gray sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to rain. She stood in the parking lot for a moment. Somewhere behind her, the ER kept running, the way ERs do, without acknowledgement or pause, because there is always another patient and the building doesn't stop for the people it swallows. She got in her car. She sat for a minute without starting it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The number was not saved in her contacts. It was a 571 area code, Northern Virginia, and the call came in at 7:31 a.m., which meant someone had been waiting for a specific time that coincided almost exactly with when they would have estimated she was leaving the building. She stared at it. The phone buzzed a second time. She answered. Voss? The voice was male, unhurried, with the specific kind of flatness that came not from being bored, but from being the kind of person who had trained the emotion out of their professional communication so thoroughly that it no longer came back even off duty. "Yes," she said, "you're familiar with a Captain Dale Reinhold." It was not a question. She felt something shift very quietly, somewhere in the center of her chest. "Yes," she said again. "He was transported last night to Harlow General following a vehicle incident on I-84. He's in your ICU." She closed her eyes briefly. The chest trauma patient. The man in his 40s. The one who had been gone for 90 seconds and come back. "I didn't know who he was," she said. "We know. We're not calling about that." A brief pause. "We're calling because of what you did, and because of what we know about you, and because we'd like to have a conversation. I've been suspended." "We know that too." Another pause, and for a moment she could hear something in the background. The sound of a large building, institutional ventilation, the ghost of a keyboard. "Ms. Voss, you've worked very hard to stay below the waterline. We understand why. But Captain Reinhold is alive because of decisions you made last night that most people in that building couldn't have made correctly under those conditions." She didn't respond. "We'd like to meet," the voice said. "Tomorrow morning. We can come to you." She looked at the hospital entrance across the parking lot. Through the glass she could see the shape of the ER in its early morning configuration. Staff moving, monitors cycling, the steady mechanical rhythm of a place that ran on urgency. "Who are you?" she said. The voice gave her a name, a rank, and an office that she recognized without needing it explained. Her hands were very still on the steering wheel. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Yes." She thought about the suspension notice folded in her bag. She thought about Dr. Finch and his incident report and the phrase breach of established clinical protocol repeated 3 times. She thought about Paula asking her where it came from and her not answering because the answer was something she had kept below the waterline for 2.5 years for reasons that had seemed up until approximately 45 seconds ago like they were going to hold indefinitely. "All right," she said. She hung up. The parking lot was quiet. A crow landed on the edge of a cart returned 30 feet away and looked at her with the flat, assessing attention of a crow. She started the car. She didn't know yet, not fully, what the next 48 hours were going to look like. She had a rough shape of it. She'd had a rough shape of things before. In other places, under other names, in situations where the margin between rough shape and actual outcome had been considerably more dangerous than a hospital administrative review. What she did know was that Dale Reinhold was upstairs in the ICU, alive, and that someone with a 571 area code had been watching what happened in that trauma bay last night and had drawn conclusions she had spent 2.5 years making sure nobody was positioned to draw. The waterline, she understood now, had already broken. She pulled out of the parking lot and onto the street, and the hospital disappeared in her rearview mirror, and the gray sky finally made up its mind, and it began to rain. The following morning at 6:08 a.m., a black government-plated SUV pulled up in front of Harlow General Hospital's main entrance and 4 people got out. 3 of them were in military dress. The 4th was a woman in a dark jacket who walked like someone who had spent years moving through spaces designed to slow people down. They went to the nurse's station. "We need Nora Voss." The charge nurse, not Paula, who wasn't on until 8, looked up with the expression of someone who had processed a great many unexpected things in the last 12 hours, but not quite this. "She's been suspended. She's not on the premises." The woman in the jacket nodded. "We know. We need her location. I can't give out employee information. We're not asking as a courtesy." The woman in the jacket placed a document on the counter. It was government issued and bore a seal that the charge nurse had never seen in person, but had seen on television, which turned out to produce a similar effect. "We're asking as a matter of record." The charge nurse stared at the document. She stared at the 4 people on the other side of the counter. Down the hall, through the windows of the trauma bay, the monitors cycled through their routines. The new equipment layout stood clean and open against the far wall, exactly as designed, with the secondary card exactly where Dr. Finch had specified it should be. The charge nurse picked up the phone. 3 miles away, in a rental unit with rain still on the windows, Nora Voss was sitting at a kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a folded suspension notice in front of her when her phone rang again. She answered on the second ring. "They're here," the charge nurse said. Not Paula. Someone younger, someone Nora didn't know well, voice pitched slightly too high. "At the hospital. 4 of them. Military. They have paperwork." "I know," Nora said. "Tell them I'm on my way." She hung up before the charge nurse could ask any follow-up questions she wasn't prepared to answer. She stood up from the kitchen table, looked at the cold coffee, and left it where it was. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. The suspension notice she folded and put in her inside pocket, not because she needed it, but because she had learned a long time ago that paperwork you've been handed is paperwork you keep. The drive to Harlow General took 7 minutes. She parked in the visitor lot because she didn't have a badge anymore, and the staff lot required a scan. That detail, parking in the visitor lot at the hospital where she'd worked for 2.5 years, landed in a specific way she didn't examine too closely. She walked in through the main entrance, past the information desk, and turned left toward the ER. They were waiting in the corridor outside the department entrance. The woman in the dark jacket she'd expected. The 3 military personnel she'd expected. What she hadn't anticipated was a 4th figure standing slightly apart from the group, in civilian clothes, with one arm in a soft sling and the particular held-together posture of someone who had discharged themselves from a hospital bed against medical advice. She stopped. Dale Reinhold looked older than she remembered, which was accurate. It had been 6 years since the last time she'd seen him, and the years between had clearly not been restful ones. He had new lines around his eyes and a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before, and he was pale in the way people are pale when they've lost blood recently and the body hasn't entirely forgiven them for it yet. He was also standing, which meant he was more stubborn than most of the medical staff upstairs had probably recommended. "You look terrible," she said. He almost smiled. "You look like someone who got fired." "Suspended." "Right." He shifted his weight slightly, favoring his left side. Same thing from the outside. The woman in the dark jacket, who had introduced herself on the phone as Major Celeste Okafor, though she'd given no other context, stepped forward. "Ms. Voss, thank you for coming in." "I didn't have much of a reason to be anywhere else," Nora said. "We'd like to speak somewhere private. The hospital has offered us a conference room." Nora looked at Reinhold. "Should you be standing?" "Probably not." He said it without any particular feeling about it. "Are you going to make an issue of it?" "I already made an issue of you once this week." She looked at Okafor. "Lead the way." The conference room was on the second floor, same one where Finch had run his restructure meeting 10 days earlier. Someone had cleared the table and set up a laptop at one end. The blinds were half closed. There was a government seal on the folder that Okafor placed at the center of the table, and Nora looked at it and then looked away and sat down. Reinhold took the chair to her left. He moved carefully, the way people move when they're trying not to show how much something hurts, which was not particularly successful. "You should be in bed," she said quietly, not for the benefit of anyone else in the room. "I'll sleep when this is done," he said, equally quiet. Okafor opened the folder. She was direct in the way career military people are direct when they're in a room where they don't have time to be anything else. She was maybe 45, with close-cropped hair and the kind of face that processed information faster than it revealed it. "Ms. Voss," she said, "we're going to start with what we know, then we're going to talk about why we're here." "All right. You served as a combat medical specialist with the 75th Ranger Support Element for 4 years, deployed twice to active conflict zones, and held a secondary certification in advanced trauma management that at the time of your separation exceeded the civilian equivalent of a trauma surgery first assist qualification." She paused. "Does that description require any correction?" "No," Nora said. "You separated from service 6 years ago under circumstances that are documented in your file and which we are not here to relitigate." Nora said nothing. "You completed civilian nursing licensure 18 months after your separation, accepted a position at Harlow General approximately 2 years later, and have since worked exclusively night shifts in the emergency department." Okafor looked up from the folder. In 2.5 years, you have not applied for a single promotion, transfer, or expanded role. Night shifts work for me. They work for someone who doesn't want to be noticed, Okafor said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement delivered with the precision of someone who had read a file carefully. Which is a waste, but we'll come back to that. She glanced at Reinhold. Captain Reinhold's presence here is relevant in 2 ways. The first is obvious. You saved his life 2 nights ago. The second is less obvious, and it connects to the reason we reached out when we did. What's the second way? Nora said. Okafor nodded at one of the other personnel in the room, who opened a secondary folder. Reinhold's convoy was on Interstate 84 for a reason. He was returning from a site assessment related to an ongoing operational security review. The crash that injured him was not an accident. The room was quiet. Someone caused it, Nora said. Someone caused it, Okafor confirmed. We are currently in the early stages of determining who and why. Reinhold was the only member of the convoy with full knowledge of what the site assessment covered. She paused. Which means whoever arranged the crash had access to operational information at a level that is currently of significant concern. Nora looked at Reinhold. He was looking at the table. That's why you came yourself, she said to him. You're not here as a patient. I'm also here as a patient, he said. Technically. Dale? He looked up. It was the first time she'd used his first name in front of anyone in the room, and she registered the slight shift it produced. A loosening of formality that nobody commented on, but everyone noticed. There's a leak, he said simply. Somewhere between here and where I was coming from. We don't know how high it goes. We don't know how long it's been in place. What we know is that the crash was targeted and I was supposed to be in worse shape than I am. Because of what you saw at the site. Because of what I can testify to, yeah. She sat with that for a moment. Outside the half-closed blinds, the hospital went about its business. Muffled overhead announcements, the distant beep of monitors, the particular institutional background noise of a building full of people managing emergencies. What do you need from me? She said. Okafor leaned forward slightly. We need a qualified medical professional who is not currently affiliated with any active military medical unit, who has the background to serve as a support resource during Reinhold's recovery period, and who has the security clearance baseline that makes it possible to read her into the specifics of what we're working with. She paused. Your clearance from your service period is technically still on record. It was never formally revoked because your separation didn't require it. Nora looked at her. You want me to provide medical support for a classified recovery? Among other things, yes. I've been suspended from the hospital where I was a civilian nurse. We know. That situation is also something we intend to address. Okafor's expression didn't change, but something in it sharpened. The incident report filed by Dr. Finch has been reviewed by 2 separate military medical authorities at our request. The consensus is that your interventions during the mass casualty event were not only within the scope of your training, they were the correct interventions, executed correctly, under conditions that would have challenged a physician. A beat. The suspension should not have occurred. We are prepared to make that clear to hospital administration in terms they will understand. That's not why I did it. We know that too. Okafor looked at her steadily. That's part of why we're here. Amrad. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Nora asked questions and got answers that were complete enough to be useful without being complete enough to constitute a full briefing, which was standard, and she understood it. She had operated inside that particular architecture of partial information before. You got what you needed for the next decision and nothing more. And you trusted that the people above you in the chain had reasons for the rest of it. That trust had not always been rewarded. That was also something she understood. When they wrapped up, Okafor asked her to give them an answer within 24 hours. Reinhold walked with her to the elevator because they both knew there was more to say that hadn't been said in the room. The elevator door closed and he leaned against the wall, and she looked at him and didn't pretend she wasn't assessing his color and his breathing and the way he held his arm. How bad is the internal damage? She said. 2 cracked ribs, some muscle tearing on the left side, and a laceration they had to go back in and re-stitch this morning because I apparently moved wrong. He said it flatly. Concussion? Mild. They're making more of it than it is. They're right to make more of it than it is, she paused. You should be in bed for another 4 days minimum. I needed to be here. You needed to see for yourself that I was actually here, she said. That's different. He looked at her. Yeah, he said after a moment. That's different. The elevator stopped at the ground floor. The doors opened onto the main corridor and the hospital moved around them. A volunteer pushing a cart, 2 nurses in conversation, a family clustered near the information desk with the particular tight-grouped anxiety of people waiting for news. Why did you never come forward, he said. Not accusing, not particularly gentle either, just asking. After you separated, you had quals that most civilian hospitals would have paid for. You had case experience that I know what I had. Then why bury it? She watched the family near the information desk. One of them, a woman maybe 60 years old, was holding a phone against her chest with both hands, the way people hold things when the thing itself is the only anchor they have. Because staying visible was going to cost more than going quiet, she said, and I was tired. He didn't say anything. That's the honest answer, she said. I was tired and I made a choice, and the choice held until it didn't. She turned to look at him. How long has your team been watching this hospital? We weren't watching the hospital. We were looking for the convoy leak, and the background investigation put Reinhold in Harlow, and he stopped. 3 weeks. Maybe a little more. And you didn't contact me. We didn't know if we needed to. He met her eyes. Then the crash happened and you ran that trauma bay and it changed the calculation. She nodded slowly. I'll give Okafor an answer tomorrow. I figured you would. He paused. Thank you for the other night. I don't have a better way to say it than that. You would have done the same. I would have tried. He said it honestly, without ego. I don't know if I would have gotten there. The elevator behind them opened again and deposited 2 orderlies in a supply cart, and the moment broke, and she put her hands in her jacket pockets and he straightened off the wall carefully. Get back upstairs, she said, and stay there this time. She didn't go home. She went instead to the only diner within walking distance of the hospital that opened before 7 a.m. A small, overcrowded place called Parsons with booths that hadn't been reupholstered since someone decided orange vinyl was timeless, and a coffee situation that was technically correct. She took a booth near the window and ordered coffee she intended to drink, and food she wasn't sure she was going to eat, and sat there looking at the rain on the glass and letting herself think. The thing about spending years staying below the waterline is that it becomes its own kind of structure. You stop expecting to be seen, and after a while the not being seen stops feeling like a loss and starts feeling like function. Nora had built a version of herself that fit into the night shift ER at Harlow General, the way something fitted slides into something it was designed for. Not flourishing, but functional. Managing. Doing what she'd come to do, which was be useful to people who needed it in the most direct possible way without attracting the kind of attention that complicated things. She had known, somewhere, that it wasn't permanent. Things you build to manage rather than to last don't last. She had just thought she'd have more time. She drank her coffee and watched a bus stop across the street where a man in a yellow slicker stood waiting with the resigned patience of someone who had made their peace with rain as a permanent condition of existence. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Paula. What is happening? The military people were here. Admin is in a meeting and nobody is telling anyone anything. She typed back, I'll explain when I can. Are you okay? 3 dots appeared, then, I'm fine. Are you okay? She thought about how to answer that and then typed, working on it. She put the phone face down on the table. The food arrived, eggs she'd ordered out of obligation and toast she would actually eat. And she ate the toast and moved the eggs around and thought about Dale Reinhold upstairs with cracked ribs and a restitched laceration, standing in a corridor he wasn't supposed to be standing in because he'd needed to verify something in person that could have been handled over a secure line. That was always the thing about people who'd operated in high-risk environments long enough. You stopped fully trusting anything you hadn't verified yourself. It wasn't paranoia, exactly. It was the residue of having been in situations where the gap between reported and actual was the gap between alive and not. She understood it. She had it herself. It was part of what made the 2.5 years at Harlow livable. The ER gave her problems that were real and immediate and verifiable in ways that administrative medicine never did. Either the patient was improving or they weren't. Either the intervention worked or it didn't. There was a clarity to it that she'd needed and had gotten, right up until the moment the clarity had cost her the position that provided it. She paid her bill and went back to the parking lot. She sat in her car. She had 23 hours left to give Okafor an answer. She already knew what the answer was. She'd known since she'd heard Reinholdt's voice in the conference room and understood that the crash on I-84 had not been random and that someone with access to operational information had made a decision that had put him on her trauma table. The question that remained was how deep it went. Not for Okafor's purposes. That was Okafor's problem to manage. But for hers. Because if there was a leak at the level Okafor was suggesting, it meant the information that had put Reinholdt on that highway was accessible to someone inside a structure that had people Nora had worked alongside. And Nora had learned, in places she could still not discuss, that leaks at that level tended to have longer histories than anyone initially assumed. She started the car. Tip. Back at the hospital, she didn't know yet that while she'd been at Parsons, Finch had been called into the department head's office. He'd assumed it was a routine debrief on the mass casualty event that was scheduled for end of week, and it wasn't unusual for the department head to want a preliminary conversation. He'd gone in with his incident report and his documentation and the comfortable certainty of a man who had done everything correctly. Dr. Warren Elkin, the department head, was 61 years old, had run the department for 9 years, and had the kind of measured professional temperament that could be mistaken for warmth until you understood that what it actually was caution. He sat behind his desk with a folder in front of him and gestured for Finch to sit. Finch sat. "I assume this is about the Saturday event." "Partly," Elkin said. He opened the folder. "We received a communication this morning from a government medical affairs office. It's been forwarded to me by administration." He turned a page. "It pertains to Nora Voss." Finch kept his expression neutral. "I've filed the incident report. The suspension stands until the clinical review. The clinical review has been requested to be expedited," Elkin said, "by the military personnel currently in this building." A beat. "They can't dictate our clinical review process." "No, but they can submit a formal assessment from 2 senior military trauma physicians that characterizes Voss's interventions as consistent with her documented training, appropriate to the conditions present, and within the scope of certifications she holds that are not reflected in her civilian nursing file." Elkin looked at him over the top of the folder. "Which raises some questions." Finch said nothing. "Did you know," Elkin said, and his voice had not changed at all. It was still the same measured professional tone, that Voss held advanced military medical certifications at a level that exceeds standard nursing scope. "No," Finch said, "because it wasn't in her file." "It wasn't in the file she submitted for civilian employment, correct. It is in a military records file that, as of this morning, has been partially declassified at the request of the government office currently communicating with our administration." Elkin closed the folder. "This creates a problem, Marcus." Finch felt something tighten in his chest that he recognized as the early stages of a situation that was not going the direction he'd assumed. "I followed protocol. She acted outside her documented scope. Outside her documented civilian scope," Elkin said, "which she may not have had any obligation to disclose in full, depending on the classification status of the relevant records, which is being determined now." A pause. "Additionally, I've been asked to revisit the equipment layout change and the objections that were filed prior to implementation. That layout was approved by— the objections were filed 3 times, Elkin said, once to department, twice through patient safety. The third one includes a technical diagram that I have now had 2 senior ER physicians look at. Both of them said the concern was valid." The room was very quiet. "She moved the cart herself," Finch said, "during the event, without authorization." "She moved it 6 inches, Elkin said, "and the patient she stabilized is alive." He looked at Finch for a moment that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. "I'm not having a disciplinary conversation with you today. I'm telling you that the landscape has shifted significantly since yesterday morning and that you need to be prepared for the clinical review to go in a direction that was not the one you anticipated." He picked up the folder. That's all. Finch stood. He wasn't entirely certain his face was doing what he wanted it to. He walked to the door. Marcus? Elkin said. He stopped. The incident report you filed. The patient she saved. Did you check who he was? Finch turned slightly. The chart listed an unaffiliated civilian name. Trauma intake, no insurance, ID on arrival. Run the name against the Federal Registry, Elkin said, and then come back and talk to me. Finch left. He went to his office, which was a small room with a window facing the parking lot, and he closed the door and pulled up the Federal Medical Registry on his computer. He typed in the name from the trauma intake chart. The page loaded. He sat back in his chair. The name on the chart had a flag on it, a federal marker that he'd seen precisely once before in 9 years of practice, on a patient who had been transferred to a military medical facility within 12 hours of arrival. The flag didn't explain anything. It never did. It just indicated federal jurisdiction, which meant that the man on his trauma table 2 nights ago had not been an unaffiliated civilian. It meant that Nora Voss had stabilized a federally flagged patient. And it meant that the incident report Marcus Finch had filed that morning, which accused her of protocol violations in doing so, was now sitting in the same administrative record as a federal government communication defending her qualifications and requesting an expedited review. He looked out the window at the parking lot. He had been right about the protocol. He had been completely right about the protocol. She had operated outside the documented scope of a civilian ER nurse, and he had filed the correct documentation in response to that, and he had done it by the book, and the book was now turning out to have been an incomplete version of the relevant information. That was not a comfortable position to be in. He picked up his phone and called the physician he'd consulted that morning at 6 a.m. to authorize the suspension. The call went to voicemail. He called administration directly and was told, politely, that the relevant parties were in a meeting and would return his call. He put the phone down. In the parking lot below, he could see Nora Voss's car pulling back in. A gray sedan, nothing notable about it. And he watched her get out and walk toward the entrance, hands in her jacket pockets, not looking up. He watched her until she was inside. She went back to the second floor. Okafor was still in the conference room, which had apparently been made available for the rest of the morning. One of the military personnel was outside in the corridor with a laptop, running what looked like a secure connection given the cable configuration. Nora went in and sat down. "I have an answer," she said. Okafor looked up from the folder. "That's faster than 24 hours. "I know." She put her hands flat on the table. "I'm in, but I have conditions." "Tell me." "The clinical review runs its full course. I don't want it shortened or overridden by military pressure. I want the outcome to be actual, not manufactured." Okafor nodded. "That's reasonable. The equipment layout issue goes through the proper patient safety channel. It doesn't get buried because there's a bigger situation happening. Someone's going to walk into that ER next week and need that card accessible, and I want the record to show the objections were valid. Also reasonable." "And Reinhold," she said, "he stays in this building for at minimum 3 more days regardless of what comes up operationally. Whoever needs to know things he knows can come here. He does not travel." Okafor looked at her. There was something in the look that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "You want to dictate Captain Reinhold's medical restrictions. I want to state them clearly so nobody gets to pretend they weren't stated." Nora held her gaze. "He has a restitched laceration and 2 cracked ribs and a concussion. If he goes into the field in the next 72 hours and something happens to him, it happens on a foundation of decisions that didn't account for his actual condition. He won't like it. He doesn't have to like it." Okafor looked at her for a moment longer, then wrote something in the margin of the document in front of her. "All right," she said. "Those conditions are accepted." Nora sat back. The rain against the window had softened from full rain to something that hadn't decided yet whether to stop. She thought about the man in the yellow slicker at the bus stop and whether he'd gotten where he was going. "One more thing," she said. "Go ahead." "The leak you're looking for, the operational information that put Reinhold on that road." She looked at Okafor directly. "How confident are you in the people already assigned to that investigation?" The question landed carefully, and Okafor heard exactly what it was asking. "Why do you ask?" Okafor said. Because you came to me, which means you need someone outside the existing structure. Nora kept her voice even, which means you're not fully confident in what's inside it. The room was quiet for a long moment. We're working on it, Okafor said. I know. I'm asking how long that's been the answer. Okafor put her pen down. She looked at Nora with the particular attention of someone who has just recalibrated upward. Longer than we'd like, she said finally. Then we need to move faster than the review timeline suggests, Nora said. Because if someone arranged a crash to keep Reinhold quiet, and that someone has access to operational information at the level you're indicating, then Reinhold being in this hospital and still alive and in a room that's accessible. She stopped. She stopped because she'd heard something she shouldn't have been able to hear over the ambient sound of the hospital and the rain and the corridor outside. A change in the quality of the building's noise, something specific and wrong, too practiced and too abrupt. She was on her feet before she'd finished the thought. Okafor was already moving. In the ICU on the third floor, 4 seconds earlier, the monitor connected to Captain Dale Reinhold's bed had begun sounding an alarm that was not a malfunction. They hit the stairwell at the same time, Nora half a step ahead, because she already knew the floor plan and Okafor wasn't slowing her down trying to. The ICU was on 3. The stairwell door opened onto the north corridor, and they came through it fast, not running. Running in a hospital pulls every eye in the building, and right now the last thing either of them needed was attention. But moving at the specific pace that hospital staff recognize as something is wrong without triggering the kind of visible alarm that tells the wrong people they've been noticed. One of Okafor's personnel was already at the ICU entrance, hand on the doorframe, listening. He looked at Okafor and held up 2 fingers. 2 people inside who weren't supposed to be. The floor nurse at the ICU station was standing with her back pressed against the medication cabinet, hands visible, not moving. She was young, maybe her 2nd year, and she was doing exactly what someone does when they've been told to stay still by people who made it clear that still was the safer option. Her face was a controlled mask with fear running directly underneath it, the way a road looks fine until the rain hits and you see the water moving beneath it. Nora looked through the interior window panel. Reinhold's room was 3 beds down. Through the glass, she could see a figure at the bedside doing something to the IV line, and a second figure positioned near the door with a sight line to the corridor. The monitor alarm that had triggered was not from Reinhold's primary line. It was from the secondary drip, which meant whoever was at the bedside had interfered with it, and the machine had flagged an incompatibility. Reinhold was conscious. She could see that from here. He was not moving, which meant he'd assessed the situation and made the same calculation she would have made. Don't escalate until you know the exits. She turned to Okafor, kept her voice below a murmur. What's in his secondary drip? Electrolyte maintenance, normal saline base. If they've pushed something into that line, it's already been in his bloodstream for, she glanced at the time on the wall display, possibly 90 seconds. Okafor's face didn't change, but something behind it did. She looked at her personnel by the door and gave him a hand signal Nora didn't know, but understood from context. Go, now, quiet. He went in. Nora was 3 steps behind him before Okafor could make a decision about whether to stop her, and Okafor, to her credit, didn't try. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that resolves without cost. The figure near the door turned and had time to make a decision that she made wrong, and the military personnel handled that with the efficiency of someone who had been in rooms where decisions got made wrong before. There was a collision, a controlled takedown that put the figure against the wall and then the floor, and Nora went past both of them directly to Reinhold's bedside. The figure at the IV line spun around. Male, maybe 35, in hospital-issue scrubs that fit slightly wrong across the shoulders, in the way clothes fit when you've put them on over something you were actually wearing. He'd had training. She could see it in the way he planted his feet and assessed the space. She was not there to fight him. She was there for the IV line, which she clamped at the junction point with one hand and yanked the secondary access port free with the other before he'd finished his assessment. The alarm on the monitor changed pitch. She used her elbow to hit the emergency call button on the wall panel and then stepped back out of his reach, putting the bed between herself and him. because she had done what she came to do, and she was not a soldier anymore, and she was aware of exactly which category of threat she represented and which she didn't. He looked at her across the bed. "It's already in the line," he said. "I know," she said, "which is why you're going to tell me what it was." He didn't. He turned for the window, which was the option she'd have taken too, but Okafor was already in the room, and the calculation changed, and he stopped. Reinhold looked at Nora from the bed. He was pale and controlled, and there was a quality in his expression that she recognized. The particular look of a person who is making an active effort to stay functional while their body is sending signals they are choosing to override. "Your arm," she said. He lifted the arm that wasn't in the sling. She looked at the IV site. The skin around the secondary port insertion point was already showing a faint change. Not dramatic, not the obvious flush of a known allergic response, but a subtle mottling that indicated his vascular system was responding to something it hadn't been given by his treatment team. "What do you feel?" she said. "Warm. Hands." "Numbness?" Starting. She looked at the clamped line. There was a residual amount in the tubing between the port and the clamp. She'd gotten there fast enough that most of whatever had been pushed hadn't delivered. But fast enough was a relative term, and she didn't know what she was dealing with. She looked at the man in the scrubs, who was now against the wall with Okafor's personnel managing his position. "If you tell me what it was, the treatment response is faster and he has a better outcome. If you don't, we start from broad spectrum and hope we guess right." She said it without heat. "That's not a negotiation. That's a timeline." He said nothing. She turned back to Reinhold. "Stay with me. Talk." "I'm here," he said. "What's your pain level?" 6, maybe 7. Ribs. The ribs are the same as this morning? Worse. A pause. The warm feeling is moving up my arms. She hit the call button a second time and raised her voice to carry through the door. "I need a crash cart, and I need the ICU attending now. Possible IV contamination, unknown agent, patient is conscious and symptomatic." She turned back to Reinhold. "Look at me. Don't look at the ceiling. Don't look at your arm. Look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were steady. The rest of him was working hard to stay that way. "We're going to pull the line completely and get access in the other arm," she said. "I'm going to need you to not move when I do it, because you have stitches I do not want to redo today." "Third time would be excessive," he said. His voice was slightly thicker than it had been 60 seconds ago. "It would." She found the secondary IV setup on the supply shelf, standard ICU setup, everything where it should be. And she was already prepping the new access site on his right arm when the ICU attending came through the door at a pace that indicated the emergency call had landed with appropriate urgency. Dr. Amani Ferris was maybe 50, with the particular rapid assessment quality of someone who had been running ICUs long enough that she processed the room in about 2 seconds and came directly to the bedside. "What do we have?" Ferris said. "IV contamination at the secondary port. Unknown agent. Symptom onset approximately 2 minutes ago, presenting with bilateral upper extremity warming and progressive numbness moving proximal." Nora stepped back from the IV setup to give Ferris room to take over. "I've clamped and removed the secondary line. He got a partial dose. I don't know the volume, but the port was open for less than 2 minutes before I clamped." Ferris looked at the port site, at Reinhold. "What are you feeling?" "Arms," he said. "Warm, numb. It's moving." "Headache?" "No." "Vision?" "Fine." Ferris moved to the wall panel and started ordering labs in the rapid-fire way that meant she'd already formed a working hypothesis. She looked briefly at Nora. "You pulled the line fast." "Yes." "Good call." She said it without ceremony, the way a professional acknowledges a correct decision by another professional. Not effusive, just accurate. Then she was back to her patient, and the conversation was over. Nora stepped into the corridor. The figure from the door, the one who'd been taken down by Okafor's personnel, was sitting against the wall with his hands secured behind him, and he had the look of someone who had accepted that the situation was over while simultaneously not being ready to say anything about it. The young floor nurse was still at her station, now with a colleague who had come down from the adjacent unit, and she was giving a statement to one of Okafor's people in a voice that shook in places but held. Okafor came out of the room behind Nora. "The one at the IV line," Okafor said, low. "He's not talking." "I know." "We'll get him processed. The identification is going to take time." "The scrubs," Nora said. "They were too wide across the shoulders and too short in the torso. He got them from the supply room, not a locker, which means he came in with access or someone gave him access." She looked at Okafor. "Someone inside this building let him in." Okafor didn't respond, which was itself a response. "The leak isn't just operational," Nora said. "It's here. It's current. Someone knew Reinhold was in this hospital and in that specific room." She kept her voice controlled, but she felt the weight of it shifting, the shape of what she'd thought she was walking into versus what it actually was. "Which means when you said you're not fully confident in the existing investigation structure, I meant it," Okafor said. "How many people knew you were coming to Harlow?" A pause that lasted 2 seconds too long. "Okafor," Nora said. "7, she said, "within our office, plus administrative contacts for the hospital coordination." Nora looked at the corridor, at the floor nurse giving her statement, at the man sitting against the wall with his hands secured, at the door to Reinhold's room, through which she could hear Ferris's voice running through the treatment protocol with the calm urgency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. 7 people plus administrative contacts. And someone had gotten 2 people into the ICU in scrubs with IV access, and enough knowledge of Reinhold's room assignment and line configuration to target the secondary port specifically. The secondary port. Not the primary. The secondary, which would have been slower to flag, slower to alarm, slower to produce visible symptoms. Whoever had designed the intervention had medical knowledge, not just access. That was the part that sat wrong. She turned to Okafor. "I need the patient records for everyone admitted to this unit in the last 48 hours. I need the visitor logs, the staff sign-ins for every shift since Reinhold was transferred here, and I need to know who was in the building this morning between 6 and 7 a.m. Oh, that's a hospital administration request. They can't release—" "They will release it," Nora said, "because a federal patient was just targeted in their ICU, and the moment that becomes the official characterization of what happened 20 minutes ago, their cooperation stops being a courtesy and starts being a legal requirement." She looked at Okafor directly. "And I need it before whoever gave those 2 men access to this floor figures out the access failed." Okafor looked at her. "You said you needed someone outside the existing structure," Nora said. "I'm outside it. Tell me what I need." For a long moment, the corridor held the particular suspended quality of a decision that hasn't been made yet, but is about to be. The monitor in Reinhold's room continued its re-established rhythm. The young floor nurse finished her statement. The man against the wall looked at the middle distance and said nothing. Then Okafor took out her phone. "Give me 10 minutes, she said, and walked to the end of the corridor. Nora went back into Reinhold's room. Ferris was adjusting the new IV access and running through a secondary vitals check, and Reinhold was cooperating with the particular resigned compliance of a man who understood that his body was currently requiring things of him he had not budgeted for. The warmth in his arms had not progressed further. That was something. "You're going to be fine," Nora said, not as reassurance, as information. He looked at her. "How fine?" "Ferris is good and you got a partial dose. Probably fine." She paused. "Probably." "Great," he said. "That's great." She pulled the chair from the corner and sat down beside the bed, because she was not leaving this room until Okafor came back with what she'd asked for. And she was not leaving Reinhold alone in it until they knew how far inside the building the access went. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "You knew, before the alarm. You heard something. Change in the building noise," she said. "Something moved wrong. You couldn't have heard that from 2 floors down." "I know." She looked at her hands. "I don't entirely know how to explain it." He turned his head to look at her. The color in his face was slightly better. Not good, but better. "I could explain it," he said, "but you'd tell me I'm wrong." "Probably." She looked at the door. "Rest. I need to think." He closed his eyes. His breathing evened out, not sleep, just the deliberate kind of stillness that people train into themselves when the alternative is running on adrenaline until the body quits. Nora looked at the door, at the corridor beyond it where Okafor was on the phone. 7 people in their office had known they were coming to Harlow, plus administrative contacts. She started counting back through the morning, who had been where, when, what had been said, and to whom, who had been in the building before Okafor's team arrived, who had known Reinhold was being kept on the 3rd floor versus the 2nd, who had known the specific room number. She got to a name she didn't want to get to. She sat very still with it for a moment, the way you sit with something that changes the architecture of what you thought you understood. Then she took out her phone and called Paula. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. Paula always answered her phone. The call went to voicemail. Paula's voicemail was a generic recording. No name, just a prompt to leave a message. Nora hung up without leaving one and called again immediately. 4 rings. 5. Voicemail. She stood up. Reinhold opened his eyes. He'd heard the calls fail even with his eyes closed. Problem? Possibly. She was already doing math she didn't want to be doing. Paula had been at the nurses' station when Okafor's team arrived. She had texted Nora at, she checked the timestamp, 7:43 a.m. That was after the team came in, after the charge nurse had been approached, after the conference room meeting had been set up. Paula would have known within minutes that military personnel were in the building, would have known they were asking for Nora, would have known the general shape of the situation even without specifics. And Paula, as charge nurse for the night team, had access to patient room assignments, had access to the admission logs, had access to the kind of administrative infrastructure that could tell someone exactly where a specific patient had been transferred. Nora pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum for a moment. A headache she hadn't noticed before was starting at the base of her skull. She had worked alongside Paula Dreyer for 2.5 years. Paula had handed her the suspension notice with the look of someone who cared about the outcome. Paula had texted her this morning with the question, "Are you okay?" And the words had felt genuine because Paula was, in every observable way, a person who meant what she said, which was exactly the kind of person you put in a position where you needed information moved without anyone noticing it move. She went to the door. Okafor. Okafor was still on the phone at the end of the corridor, but she looked up and read Nora's face and said something brief into the phone and walked over. "The charge nurse on the night team," Nora said. "Paula Dreyer. I need you to run her." Something shifted in Okafor's expression. Why? She had access to Reinhold's room assignment. She knew you were in the building this morning. She texted me about it. She kept her voice below the level of the 2 personnel still managing the corridor situation. "She's not answering her phone. She should be on shift. Could be any number of—" "Run her," Nora said. "Please." Okafor looked at her for a moment. Then she made another call. Nora went back inside and sat down. Reinhold was watching her from the bed with the particular attention of someone who has spent years reading rooms. "Who are you thinking?" he said. "I don't know yet." "But you're thinking someone specific." "Yes." He didn't push it. That was one of the things about Dale Reinhold that she had always respected. He understood the difference between information that needed to move immediately and information that needed to settle before it was spoken out loud. Dr. Ferris came back through with updated lab results on a tablet. She showed them to Nora without being asked, which was the specific kind of professional respect that gets extended when someone has earned it in front of you rather than on paper. The partial dose that had entered Reinhold's line had been a potassium chloride compound, high concentration, designed to produce cardiac arrest if delivered in full. At the volume he'd received before the line was clamped, the effect was symptomatic but not lethal. His levels were elevated but correctable. "He's going to be uncomfortable for the next several hours," Ferris said. "We'll manage it. He's not in danger." She paused. "You got there fast." "Fast enough," Nora said. Ferris looked at her in the way that people look when they're not going to say the larger thing they're thinking, but want the other person to know they're thinking it. Then she went back to her patient. Nora stayed in the chair and thought about potassium chloride and access and the specific medical knowledge required to understand that a high-concentration compound pushed into a secondary IV line would reach the heart faster than a primary line interruption. and would read, in a post-mortem, as a cardiac event consistent with a patient who already had trauma-related cardiac stress. It wouldn't have looked like murder. It would have looked like a man who'd been in a serious crash, who'd had surgery and restitching and a concussion, whose heart had given out 3 days after the incident. Tragic. Documented. Explainable. That required medical knowledge, not just access. Knowledge. She went back to the name she hadn't wanted to get to. Okafor came in 12 minutes later. She closed the door. She looked at Nora, and there was something in her face that hadn't been there before, not quite shaken, but rearranged. Paula Dreyer, she said. Night charge nurse, Bartow Harlow General ER. Licensed for 11 years, no disciplinary record. She paused. Her brother is Keith Dreyer, currently employed as a civilian logistics contractor for a federal transit management office in Salem. Another pause. That office has a contract that interfaces with 3 military transport operations, one of which was the route Reinhold's convoy was using on Saturday. The room was quiet. She didn't know what she was providing, Nora said. It came out before she'd entirely decided to say it. Paula didn't know. We don't know that. I know that. She looked at the floor. That's not who she is. Someone used her. Her brother, or someone adjacent to her brother, used what she had access to, and she probably gave it without understanding what it was for. She looked up. Where is she? Her car is in the parking lot. She hasn't signed out. Her phone is going to voicemail. She's in the building. Okafor nodded. She figured it out, Nora said, or enough of it. Whatever happened up here, the alarm, the response, the corridor being locked down, she's somewhere in this building and she's scared. Or she's in communication with whoever sent those 2 men. Find her, Nora said, before either of those things gets worse. Okafor left. Nora sat with the weight of what Paula's involvement meant. Not as a willing participant, she was nearly certain of that, but as a link in a chain she hadn't known she was part of. Paula had handed her the suspension notice at 7 in the morning with the look of someone who was sorry about it. Paula had texted, "Are you okay?" and meant it, because Paula Dreyer was a woman who had spent 11 years caring about the outcomes of people she worked with, and caring about outcomes was both her most genuine quality and the thing that had made her exploitable. The people who built these networks always found someone who cared. Caring made you answerable to people who asked you for things in the right tone, with the right context, with a reason that let you believe you were helping rather than enabling. Reinhold was watching her. "I'll tell you when I know," she said. "Okay," he said. She appreciated that he didn't try to make it smaller than it was. They found Paula 40 minutes later in the medication storage room on the first floor, which was accessed by a badge she technically shouldn't have been carrying on that floor, but which nobody had thought to deactivate because the suspension had been Nora's, not hers. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the shelving unit and her phone in her lap, and the look of someone who had been sitting in the dark of a bad decision long enough for it to become undeniable. Nora went in alone. She had asked Okafor for that, and Okafor had allowed it with the caution of someone who was extending trust she wasn't entirely sure was warranted. Paula looked up when the door opened. Her face did something complicated and then settled into something that was mostly just tired. "I knew you'd be the one to come," she said. "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at her phone. "I got a message this morning from Keith. He said there was someone in the hospital who was a government informant, and that he said there was a patient who was going to cause problems for their operation and that he just needed to know what room the patient was in." She stopped. "He said it was routine, counterintelligence. He said he was doing his job and he just needed one thing." "So you told him?" "He's my brother." Her voice came apart slightly on the last word, and she pulled it back together by force. "I told him. I didn't know what... I thought he worked logistics. I thought he was..." She pressed the phone against her leg. "And then the alarm went off upstairs and people were talking and I heard the word ICU and I started to understand what I'd done." Nora sat down on the floor in front of her. It was the kind of gesture that doesn't require explanation. 2 people at the same level in a room where the distance between them needs to close. "Paula," she said, I need you to tell me everything Keith has asked you for. Not just today, everything, and how far back it goes. Paula looked at her. I know it's going to be hard, Nora said. Tell me anyway. It took 20 minutes. Paula talked and Nora listened, and by the end of it, the shape of what had happened was clear enough to be actionable. Keith Dreer had been requesting small pieces of information from his sister for approximately 8 months. Innocuous things at first, shift schedules and department traffic patterns, the kind of data that seemed administrative and harmless. Gradually, it had escalated to patient admission information, transferred through casual conversation that Paula hadn't recognized as collection. She hadn't been asked for anything dramatic. She'd been asked for normal things in a format that felt like normal sibling conversation. That was how it was done when it was done well. Nora went back out to the corridor where Okafor was waiting and told her what she'd heard. Okafor listened with the expression of someone updating a picture that was already partially drawn. She made calls, 3 of them in sequence, each one shorter than the last, each one producing a visible narrowing of the problem from Okafor's end. Keith Dreyer was located 40 minutes later at his apartment in Salem, where he had been attempting to clear his communications history from 3 separate devices. He was approached by 2 federal agents who had been already positioned in Salem as part of the convoy leak investigation before any of this morning had happened. He was in custody before noon. The paperwork from his devices took time. That part was not cinematic. It was a federal analyst in a room somewhere turning through compressed files and metadata and communication logs, and it took the rest of the day and into the evening. Nora knew this because Okafor kept her informed in the specific incremental way that people inform you when they trust you enough to update you, but the information is still being assembled. She stayed at the hospital, not in an official capacity. Her suspension was still technically in place, but in the practical capacity of a person who was present in a building where things were still unresolved and who had demonstrated that her presence was useful. Dr. Elkin found her in the second-floor corridor at 2 in the afternoon. He looked like a man who had been revising his understanding of a situation since early morning and was not entirely pleased with where the revision had landed. Ms. Voss, he said, Dr. Elkin. He looked at the corridor for a moment. Then, I want to walk through what happened in the ICU this morning from the department's perspective. All right. You were not on duty. You were technically suspended. You entered a patient's room during an active security situation and administered, or rather, removed and clamped, an IV line. Yes. And the attending has indicated that the speed of that intervention was the determining factor in limiting the patient's exposure. That's Dr. Ferris's assessment, not mine. He looked at her. Is it wrong? She thought about it honestly. Probably not. He nodded slowly. The patient safety reports you filed, the 3 of them, have been reviewed by the committee as of this morning, the 3rd one in particular with the diagram. 2 external reviewers have characterized the concern as valid. He paused. The layout revision is being suspended pending a full safety review. That's the right call. The incident report from Dr. Finch is also under review. He said it in the careful way of a man who is navigating between an institutional position and a personal one. The military medical assessment that was submitted this morning characterizes your interventions during the mass casualty event as consistent with your documented training. That assessment is now part of the administrative record. I heard. Your suspension, he said, and stopped. Started again. Formal reinstatement will require a completed clinical review. That process has a minimum timeline. We can't shortcut without creating other problems. He looked at her. But I want you to know that the outcome, when the review completes, is not in question from where I'm standing. It wasn't an apology. She hadn't expected one. It was a senior physician acknowledging that the record was going to show what it was going to show, and that what it was going to show was not what his department head had understood when he'd authorized the suspension at 6 in the morning. Thank you, she said. Not warmly, accurately. He nodded once and left. Finch she didn't see until late afternoon, and when she saw him, it was in the parking lot rather than inside. He was walking to his car, jacket on, keys in hand, and he stopped when he registered that she was standing near the entrance. He looked like a man who had spent the day receiving information that rearranged what he'd thought he knew. and who hadn't quite found the posture that fit the new arrangement yet. He'd filed a clean, correct incident report based on the information he had. The information had been incomplete. That was not the same as being wrong, but it didn't feel like being right either, and people like Finch, people whose professional identity was organized around the quality of their judgment, found that distinction difficult to inhabit. She wasn't going to help him with it. "Voss," he said. "Dr. Finch." He stopped about 10 feet away. "The clinical review is going to take another week minimum." "I know. For what it's worth." He stopped. He clearly wasn't certain it was worth anything, which was a more self-aware position than she'd expected from him. "I didn't know about the military credentials. That wasn't... I worked from what was in the file." "I know that too," she said. "The patient safety objections." He said it like he was picking up something he wasn't sure he wanted to hold. "I should have looked at them more carefully." She looked at him. He was not a bad physician. She had watched him work during the mass casualty event, and he'd been competent under pressure in the ways that mattered. He was a man who had let the shape of his authority substitute for the content of his judgment, and the specific damage that produced was exactly the kind that was hard to see from inside. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She didn't add anything to that. She went back inside. The federal analyst report came through at 7:43 p.m. Okafor summarized it to Nora in the conference room, which had become, by default, the operational center of a situation that had started as a hospital visit and expanded into something significantly larger. The communications recovered from Keith Dreyer's devices connected him to a network that had been active for 14 months, running information from multiple civilian sources adjacent to military logistics operations across 4 states. Dreyer was not the architect. He was a node, a reasonably important one, but a node. The architect was someone higher in the logistics contracting structure, whose identity the federal investigation had been converging on for the previous 6 weeks, independently of anything that had happened in Harlow. Reinhold's convoy had been targeted because the site assessment he was returning from had produced evidence that was going to accelerate that convergence significantly. The people running the network had wanted Reinhold unable to testify. They had very nearly achieved that in 2 separate ways. "Keith Dreyer has indicated he's willing to cooperate," Okafor said. "Full cooperation in exchange for consideration. His testimony is being evaluated." "And the 2 men from the ICU," Nora said. "One is talking, one isn't. The one who's talking has given us enough to confirm the chain of instruction that led to this morning." She paused. "The contractor at the top of the structure has been identified. Federal warrants are being processed." "How long? 48 hours? 72 at most." Nora thought about Dale Reinhold 3 floors up with elevated potassium levels and cracked ribs, being kept in a building that had been, as of this morning, actively compromised. "Is he safe here now?" "We've addressed the access points," Okafor said. "The personnel situation has been contained. He's safe." She looked at Nora. "The more relevant question is whether he stays here or is transferred." "He stays," Nora said. "Until his cracked ribs are healed enough that transport doesn't risk re-injuring the laceration site. That's at minimum another 48 hours, and I'd prefer 72. Okafor almost smiled. "You're very specific about his medical restrictions." "I don't get to be general with people who ignore specific ones." Okafor accepted that and closed the folder. What happened over the next 36 hours was not the kind of thing that announced itself. It was documented and filed and processed through channels designed to turn human disaster into procedural record, which was its own kind of justice, even when it didn't feel like it from the outside. Keith Dreyer's cooperation opened threads that federal investigators had been pulling at for weeks. The contractor at the top of the structure, a man named Gerald Pask, 51, who had built a logistics consulting firm over a decade in a way that had positioned him as an indispensable interface between civilian and military supply operations, was taken into federal custody at his home in Bend at 6:20 a.m. 2 days later. The warrant covered conspiracy, federal obstruction, and attempted murder, among a secondary list of charges that the news, when it eventually reported on the arrest, characterized as extensive. Nora heard about the arrest from Okafor's text message while she was in the hospital cafeteria eating toast she'd started and put down twice. Paula Dreher was placed on administrative leave pending a federal interview. She was not charged. The investigation had concluded, after reviewing the communication records, that her role had been unwitting. She had been a source who didn't know she was a source, which was the most effective kind, and which also meant the investigation's interest in her was primarily evidential rather than prosecutorial. Her brother faced significantly more serious consequences. She knew that, and Nora suspected she would carry it for a long time in ways that wouldn't be visible from the outside, which was its own kind of punishment that no formal process would address or acknowledge. Finch's incident report was formally noted as having been filed in good faith with incomplete information. The clinical review of Nora's interventions during the mass casualty event concluded 4 days after the ICU incident, and its findings were unambiguous. Her actions had been within the scope of her documented training, appropriate to the conditions, and directly responsible for a positive patient outcome. The suspension was rescinded formally, with documentation, effective immediately. The equipment layout in the trauma bay was reverted to its original configuration, pending a full safety redesign that incorporated the concerns Nora had raised. The 3 patient safety reports she had filed were added to the hospital's formal record as documented and unaddressed warnings, which was the kind of institutional accountability that existed on paper, but mattered because paper, in hospitals, was what people read when they were deciding whether something could have been prevented. Elkin sent her a formal letter of reinstatement. He also sent, separately, a personal note that said 3 sentences. She read it once and put it away. Finch did not seek her out again. She heard through the department that he'd requested a transfer to the day attending rotation, which meant their paths would cross significantly less. She didn't spend time thinking about what that meant for him. She had enough to think about. On the morning of the 5th day after the ICU incident, Reinhold was cleared for limited mobility. Nora was there when Ferris gave him the parameters. No sustained exertion, no travel by anything other than ground vehicle with adequate cushioning for the rib site, no returning to active field status for a minimum of 3 weeks. He sat with that list and nodded at each item with the careful compliance of a man who was already calculating what 3 weeks could accommodate. "I mean it," Ferris said, and left. He looked at Nora. "She means it," he said. "She means it," Nora confirmed. He looked at the window. The rain had finally stopped 2 days ago, and the sky outside was the specific pale blue that came after a long gray stretch, the kind of color that looked temporary. "The debrief is going to want me in person. Okafor can bring the debrief here." "It's not that simple, so It is exactly that simple," she said. "You have 3 cracked ribs, a restitched laceration, and a documented concussion. And the last time you were in a room in this building without supervision, someone put potassium chloride in your IV. You're not going anywhere in the next 72 hours, and if someone needs information from you, they can come to where you are." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the pale blue sky held its temporary color against the window. "Okafor said you asked for something in exchange for your cooperation," he said. "Conditions. 3 of them." "She told me 2. He looked at her. "What was the 3rd one?" She had not told Okafor the 3rd condition out loud. She had thought it and not said it because it was the kind of condition that doesn't survive being spoken in a room full of people with institutional interests. It was the condition she'd made with herself in the parking lot of Parsons' Diner, sitting with cold coffee and a suspension notice before she'd driven back to the hospital, that she was not going to disappear again. Not because the military needed her, not because Reinhold was alive, not because the landscape had shifted and staying below the waterline had stopped being tenable, because she had spent 2.5 years managing and it had produced a specific and escalating cost, to herself, to patients, to a department that had needed someone willing to say clearly what needed to be said, and the cost had been paid by people who hadn't chosen to pay it. She looked at him. "The 3rd condition is mine," she said. "It's not yours to know." He held her gaze. Then he nodded, because that was the kind of thing Dale Reinhold understood, that some decisions belonged to the person who made them and required no explanation and no negotiation. He looked back at the window. 3 weeks, he said, before field status. 3 weeks minimum, she said, and Ferris will be the one to clear you, not your CO. My CO is going to love that. Your CO can call Ferris, she said. She'll enjoy the conversation. He almost laughed, stopped because of the ribs, and settled for the expression that was adjacent to it. Outside the window, the pale blue sky shifted slightly as a cloud moved through, and for a moment the room got dimmer, and then the cloud passed and the light came back. Nora's phone buzzed on the chair beside her. She looked at the screen. An unknown number. Not 571 this time, a different area code entirely, one she recognized after a half-second delay as belonging to a federal building in Washington she had been inside exactly once 7 years ago, for a debrief she had not been fully prepared for and had not handled with particular grace. She stared at it. Reinhold had seen her face change. "Who is it?" he said. She answered the call. She listened for 23 seconds without speaking. Then, "When?" She listened again, shorter this time. "I understand," she said, and hung up. Reinhold was watching her with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read the edges of conversations. "Okafor's debrief," she said. "It's not going to happen here." She stood up slowly. "They want us both in Washington, tomorrow morning." "You just said I wasn't going anywhere for 72 hours. "I know what I said." She looked at him. Her voice was controlled in a way that meant it was costing something to keep it that way. "The arrest this morning, Pask. The warrant covered the charges they told Okafor about. But there's a secondary investigation, one that Okafor apparently does not have full visibility into." He was very still. "The site assessment you were coming back from," she said. "The evidence you collected. They're saying it connects to something larger than the logistics network. Something they've been building a case on for over a year." She paused. "And there's a name in the secondary file. Someone inside the military medical authorization structure." Reinhold's face did not change, but something behind it shifted in a way she had not seen before. "What name?" he said. She told him. The room was quiet long enough that the monitor completed 2 full cycles. "That's not possible," he said. But the way he said it was not the way people say something is impossible. It was the way people say it when they mean, "I don't want it to be true," and know that wanting and truth are not the same category. Nora picked up her jacket. "Pack what you need," she said. "I'll talk to Ferris." Ferris did not like it. She said so in the direct, non-negotiable way that physicians say things when they've already decided the outcome and are stating the record rather than opening a discussion. She stood in the corridor outside Reinhold's room with her tablet under her arm and her expression set at a specific angle that communicated both her professional objection and her awareness that the objection was not going to change anything. "Transport by ground vehicle only," she said. "No flights. The cabin pressure variation with cracked ribs in this stage of healing is an unnecessary risk, and I won't clear him for air travel." "Ground transport," Nora confirmed. "The full distance." Ferris looked at her. "That's a 12-hour drive." 14 with rest stops. "Which he will take." Ferris looked at the door to Reinhold's room, then back at Nora. "I want vitals checked every 3 hours. I want someone qualified monitoring the laceration site for any sign of reopening. And if at any point during transport he shows any symptom consistent with—" "I'll be in the vehicle," Nora said. "I'll manage the monitoring." A pause. "You're not reinstated yet." "No, but I'm qualified." Ferris held her gaze for a long moment. Then she handed Nora a printed sheet. Discharge parameters, monitoring intervals, symptom flags, medication schedule. The sheet was detailed and precise and represented in its way a form of professional trust. "Don't let him do anything heroic in the car," she said. "I'll do my best." Ferris nodded once and walked away, already pulling up the next patient on her tablet. But they left Harlow at 5:40 in the morning. Okafor had arranged the ground transport, a black SUV with federal plates and a driver who communicated exclusively through practical information and did not attempt conversation, which suited everyone in the vehicle. Reinhold was in the back seat with 2 pillows wedged against his left side that Nora had requisitioned from the hospital linen supply before departure. She was in the back seat beside him with Ferris's monitoring sheet on her phone and a medical bag that Okafor's people had assembled with equipment she'd specified. The highway outside Harlow stretched east through country that was flat and pale in the early morning, the sky not fully light yet. the kind of pre-dawn gray that makes everything look temporary. They drove in silence for the first 40 minutes. Reinhold didn't sleep. She could tell from his breathing, but he stayed still, which was the next best thing. She checked his vitals at the first hour. Everything within acceptable range. "The name I told you last night," he said. They were somewhere east of the Cascades, the landscape having shifted from coastal wet to high desert dry, while neither of them had been paying attention to it. "Colonel Whitmore." "Yes. I've known James Whitmore for 9 years. He ran the medical authorization review for every deployment I was on in the last 6 years. He said it without heat, which was more unsettling than if he'd said it with anger. He signed off on the medical clearances for my team 3 times. I know. If he's in the secondary file, then the site assessment evidence you collected is going to be part of what closes that case," she said. "That's why they want you in Washington, not for the logistics network. For Whitmore." He was quiet. She watched the highway and thought about the architecture of it. How a man in a position of medical authorization could shape outcomes without ever touching a patient directly. Who got cleared? Who didn't? Which medical findings were reported up the chain and which ones were managed quietly? Which personnel were positioned where and when and with what level of medical support? It was a level of access that could determine the outcome of operations in ways that were nearly invisible until someone looked at the pattern rather than the individual decisions. Someone had looked at the pattern. That was what the site assessment had found. He was going to let it come back on junior personnel, Reinhold said. The things that went wrong, there were incidents over the past 2 years, medical decisions that produced bad outcomes. The investigations pointed at field medics. 2 of them were disciplined. She looked at him. One of them, he said, requested a formal review of the authorization chain above her and was denied. She separated from service 6 months later. He paused. Her name was in the site assessment file. Nora sat with that. The pattern goes back further than 14 months, she said. At minimum 3 years, he said, probably longer. He turned his head to look at her. The woman who separated, her name was Corporal Dessa Graves, 26 years old. She'd done 2 deployments, 0 disciplinary record, and after the review denial, she couldn't get a reference from anyone in her chain of command for a civilian nursing program. Nora looked at the highway. Is she working at a pharmacy counter in Boise, he said. Last I heard. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would fit inside the space the information occupied. What she understood, sitting in the back of a federal vehicle on a highway through high desert at 6:30 in the morning, was that what had happened to her had not been an isolated event. The structure that had dismissed her, that had suspended her, that had characterized her qualifications as insufficient when they were the opposite. That structure had precedence. It had practice. It had developed, over years, a specific and functional way of consuming the people inside it who were most effective and least accommodating, and producing clean documentation to explain why those people had been correctly managed. She had stayed below the waterline and thought she was protecting herself. She had been wrong about what she was protecting herself from. They arrived in Washington at just past 7 in the evening. The building they were taken to was not the one she'd been in 7 years ago. This one was newer, or at least more recently renovated, with the particular anonymous quality of federal spaces designed to be functional without being identifiable. Okafor met them in the parking structure. She looked at Reinhold and then at Nora. How is he? Stable, Nora said. Ribs are painful, but the laceration held. He needs food and 6 hours horizontal before the morning debrief. That's arranged. Okafor looked at her. There's someone who wants to speak with you tonight, before the debrief. Who? Brigadier General Lena Strauss. She runs the oversight office managing the secondary investigation. A pause. She's been running it for 11 months. She asked specifically for you. Nora looked at Reinhold. He made a small gesture with his hand that meant go and meant it. She went. Strauss was in her 60s, with close-cut silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent so many years sitting correctly in difficult rooms that it had stopped being posture and become structure. She sat behind a desk that held 3 folders and a cup of tea that had gone cold. She looked at Nora when she came in with the specific attention of someone who has read a file carefully and is now checking it against the person. Sit down, she said. Nora sat. I'm going to tell you what we know, Strauss said. And then I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to take your time before you answer. She opened the first folder. Colonel James Whitmore has been under investigation for 31 months. The investigation began with a financial audit that flagged anomalous payments routed through a medical equipment contracting subsidiary. That led to a review of authorization decisions over the previous 4 years. That review identified 37 instances where medical assessments had been altered, suppressed, or misrepresented in ways that benefited specific operational interests connected to Gerald Pask's logistics network. Nora said nothing. In 14 of those instances, the personnel who produced the original correct assessments were subsequently disciplined, transferred, or separated from service. Strauss looked up. 3 of them attempted to raise concerns through formal channels and were denied review. A pause. One of them, 7 years ago, attended a debrief in a building across town and was told, in those words, that the concerns she was raising were outside the scope of the review being conducted. The room was very quiet. That was me, Nora said. That was you, Strauss said. She held the general's gaze. 7 years ago, she had sat in a different chair in a different building and laid out, as precisely as she knew how, a sequence of decisions she had witnessed in the field that hadn't added up. Authorization calls that had come down wrong. Medical clearances that had put people in positions their documented conditions shouldn't have allowed. Incident reports that had disappeared between submission and record. She had been told, by a man in a uniform she no longer remembered the face of, that she was outside the scope. She had separated from service 4 months later. She had told herself it was because she was tired. It was because she had been made to understand, in the particular institutional language that requires no explicit threat, that the waterline was the safer option. "The name you gave Reinhold last night," Strauss said. "How did you know it?" "I didn't know it," Nora said. "I connected it. The secondary port access in the ICU required medical knowledge. I thought about who, within the authorization structure Okafor described, had that level of knowledge combined with the access to Reinhold's operational information. Whitmore's name fit both categories." She paused. "I didn't know I was right until Reinhold's face told me." Strauss looked at her for a moment. "You connected it from a hospital room in Harlow." "I had time to think," Nora said. "I'd been suspended." Something in Strauss's face shifted. Not quite a smile, but in that direction. "The question I want to ask you," she said, "is whether you're willing to provide a formal witness statement regarding the debrief 7 years ago. What you reported, what you were told, the specific language used." She paused. "It becomes part of the evidentiary record on Whitmore. It establishes that the pattern of suppression predates the current investigation timeline by several years." "Yes," Nora said. "Without conditions." Strauss looked at her. "That was faster than 24 hours. Someone told me once that hesitation costs more than mistakes." She paused. "I was the one who told me that, actually. It took me a while to apply it correctly." The debrief the next morning ran for 6 hours. Nora was present for 3 of them, the portions that related to the mass casualty event, the ICU incident, the communication chain through Keith Dreyer, and her witness account of the 7-year-old debrief. She gave her statement in the precise, documented way she'd given statements in other rooms and other contexts, factual, sequential, with no editorializing and no gaps she was tempted to fill with speculation. Reinhold's debrief ran longer. She knew because she was in a waiting room down the corridor when he went in at 9 in the morning, and he didn't come out until past 2 in the afternoon. He walked out looking like a man who had given everything in him that was useful and had nothing left to give, which was both the correct outcome and a visible one. She handed him a sandwich she'd gotten from the building cafeteria 2 hours earlier, and he took it without comment and ate it standing in the corridor. "Whitmore," she said. "In custody as of this morning," he said. "Federal warrant. The site assessment evidence combined with the financial audit records was enough for the prosecutor to move." He took another bite. He was arrested at his office at Fort Merrill at 8:15 a.m. 2 witnesses present. He paused. His aide, apparently, had been building a supplementary file for the last 4 months. She came forward this morning with it. Nora looked at the corridor wall. An aide. 23 years old, 2 years in his office. She'd been watching the pattern and documenting it without knowing what to do with what she had. He finished the sandwich. She figured it out when she heard about the arrest in Harlow. Sometimes the people who held the evidence were not the ones you expected. Sometimes they were the youngest person in the room, the one nobody thought was paying attention, building a record in silence because they understood, on some instinctive level, that the record was the only protection available. Nora understood that. She had once been that person. She had stopped being that person when the building where she'd tried to use the record had told her the record was out of scope. She was not going to let that be the end of the story. What? Whitmore's arrest processed through the federal system with the particular efficiency reserved for cases where the evidence is both substantial and clean. His charges, when filed, covered conspiracy, obstruction of military medical processes, fraudulent authorization, and accessory to the attempted murder of a federal officer. That last charge attached to the ICU incident through the communication chain that connected Pask's network to Whitmore's operational knowledge. The charges were public record within 48 hours of his arrest. They appeared in news coverage that described the case in terms of a military authorization corruption scheme without naming the specific individuals whose careers and records had been affected by it. But the people who needed to know the names already knew them. Pask's trial date was set. Whitmore's legal team filed motions that were standard and were expected to produce nothing. Keith Dreyer's cooperation agreement was formalized. The two men from Harlow General's ICU were charged separately in federal court. Nora followed the case the way she followed things she was peripheral to but invested in, with regular attention and no illusion that watching it resolve would feel the way she'd imagined resolution feeling. It didn't. That was one of the things nobody told you about justice. It was correct, and it was necessary, and it was often, when it finally arrived, quieter than you expected. The satisfaction was real, but it was a different shape than the injury. It didn't fit over the wound exactly. It was adjacent to it, and over time the adjacency was enough, but it required you to give up the idea that the ending would cancel out what had come before. She had given that idea up a long time ago. She was, in that specific way, ahead of the process. Paula Dreyer called her 3 weeks after Harlow. The call came in the early morning, which was when Paula had always been most likely to say the things she actually meant. She was a person who did her honest thinking before the day accumulated enough noise to make honesty complicated. Nora was sitting at the kitchen table in the rental unit with coffee that was this time hot, and she answered. "I need to say something," Paula said. "And I need you to just let me say it without arguing." "All right." "I gave them your name when they first started asking. The conversations with Keith, the things that seemed routine. One of the questions, maybe 3 months ago, was about whether there was anyone in the department who would notice things other people didn't. Anyone who was more capable than their file suggested." A pause. "I said your name." Nora was quiet. "I didn't know what I was answering," Paula said. "I didn't know the question was the question it was. I was talking about you the way I always talked about you, like you were the sharpest person in the building and nobody had figured out why yet." Her voice was not breaking, but it was carrying more weight than voices are designed to carry. "And that turned into whatever it turned into. In some way, I contributed to them targeting you." "Paula, I'm not asking for absolution. I'm stating a fact." "I know." Nora turned the coffee cup in her hands. "You talked about me the way you'd talk about a colleague you respected. That's not on you. Someone used it to build a picture of someone worth targeting." "Someone used everything," Nora said. "Your brother, your access, your conversations. They were systematic and they were patient and they chose you because you were trustworthy enough that nobody would think to look at what you were adjacent to." She paused. "That's not a character flaw. That's a method." Silence on the line. "I'm sorry," Paula said. It was the simple kind. 2 words, no architecture around them. "I know," Nora said. "I know you are." Paula exhaled slowly. "Are you coming back?" "To the ER." And there it was. The question that had been waiting since the parking lot in the rain, since the cold coffee in Parsons, since the moment she'd sat in a federal building in Washington and said yes, without conditions, to something she hadn't said yes to in 6 years. "Not tonight's," Nora said. Not tonight's only." Paula was quiet for a moment, then, "Days? There's something I've been asked to do that involves both." She paused. "I'll explain when I'm back." "When is that?" 2 weeks, she said. "Maybe less." The formal offer from General Strauss's office arrived in writing 10 days after the Washington debrief. It was structured as a civilian advisory role with a military medical training division. Specifically, a program being developed to train field medics in advanced trauma intervention for high-risk deployments, drawing on both military protocols and civilian emergency medicine experience. The program had been proposed twice in the previous 4 years, and defunded both times through authorization decisions that, in retrospect, had Whitmore's influence embedded in them. It was being funded now. It was being built now. And Strauss wanted someone to design the trauma curriculum who understood both sides of the line between military and civilian medicine. Someone who had operated in both environments and understood specifically where the gaps were. The letter was 4 pages. Nora read it twice and put it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. The offer was real, and it was significant, and it was in the specific technical way of things that arrive at the right time, exactly the right shape for what she had to give. She knew that. She also knew that accepting it fully would mean stepping out from the particular kind of invisibility she'd built, not just in practice, but in principle. It would mean being visible in a structure she'd spent 6 years keeping herself outside of, which required a quality of trust she'd been working on rebuilding in herself for considerably longer than 6 years. She also knew that the woman whose name had been in Reinhold's site assessment file, Corporal Dessa Graves, 26, working at a pharmacy counter in Boise, represented what happened when the people who understood where the gaps were stayed invisible. She called Strauss's office the next morning. "I have a condition," she said. "1. Go ahead." The program includes a formal review mechanism for field medics who identify authorization irregularities, a channel that goes outside the normal chain of command and reaches an independent oversight body. Built into the structure from day 1, not added later. A pause on the line. "That's not a small thing to build." "No, but it's the thing that makes the rest of it functional." She paused. "And I want Corporal Dessa Graves contacted about the program. Her record reviewed, the disciplinary notation from 3 years ago formally addressed, and if she's willing, an invitation to participate." Another pause. Longer. "Her file is part of the evidentiary record." "I know, which means it's already being reviewed. What I'm asking is that the review produce something she can use, not just something that closes a case." Strauss was quiet for a moment. "You're asking us to find the people we failed and do something about it." "I'm asking you to find at least one of them and start there," Nora said. "The rest follows if the structure is right." The line was quiet long enough that Nora thought the call might have dropped. Then Strauss said, "Both conditions are accepted." Nora looked out the window. The sky was the pale blue again, the kind that looked temporary but had been holding for 2 weeks now. "I'll need 2 weeks to settle things in Harlow," she said. "Understood." She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about the word structure, how it could mean the thing that contains you and the thing that supports you, and how the difference between those two functions was almost entirely determined by who built it and why, and whether the people inside it had any say in the building. She had spent years inside structures that contained. She was going to spend the next part of her life building one that supported. That was not a tidy distinction, and it was not going to be a tidy process. She had no illusion about that. She had spent enough time in medicine and in the field to understand that the things worth doing were almost never tidy, that the gap between a good intention and a functional outcome was crossed by sustained and imperfect effort and not by much else. She was not afraid of imperfect. She was very tired of invisible. She went back to Harlow on a Thursday. She stopped at Parsons first, the same booth near the window, the same coffee situation, and she sat there for 20 minutes in the particular way she'd sat there weeks ago, except that this time the suspension notice was not in her pocket and the sky outside was clear and the feeling in her chest was different. Not resolved, not finished, just different. Then she drove to the hospital. The ER was midday busy. Not mass casualty busy, just the sustained managed chaos of an emergency department on a weekday afternoon, which was its own specific texture. She walked in through the main entrance. She had a badge now, a temporary visitor credential that admin had issued while her formal reinstatement paperwork cleared its remaining steps. And she clipped it to her jacket and went to the nurse's station. Paula was there. She looked up when Nora came in and her face did the thing it had done in the medication storage room. complicated, then settling. "You look different," she said. "I had 2 weeks off," Nora said. "That's probably it." "It's not that." Paula looked at her for a moment. "It's something else." Nora didn't explain it. Some things didn't need explaining because the explanation would make them smaller than they were. Paula handed her a mug of coffee without being asked. "Elkin wants to see you when you have a minute." "I know. I have an appointment at 3. She looked at the trauma bay. The layout had been reverted. The secondary cart was back in the accessible position, close enough to the primary bay that a person could reach it without going around anything. It was not a dramatic change. It was 6 feet of clearance that would never appear in any document as the thing it actually was, which was the distance between a life saved and a life lost. She had put that in a written objection 3 times. It was there now. "Tell me what happened," Paula said. "The whole thing. I got pieces from the news and pieces from admin, and I still don't have a complete picture." Nora told her. She condensed it. The Washington debrief, Whitmore's arrest, the file, the program, the conditions she'd attached to her acceptance. She told it the way she gave statements, factual, sequential, without gaps filled by things she wasn't sure of. Paula listened with the full attention of someone who understood that they were hearing something that cost more to tell than it appeared. When Nora finished, Paula was quiet for a moment. "The medic in Boise," she said. "Dessa Graves." "She's been contacted," Nora said, "as of last week. Her file review is in process." "Is she—" "I don't know yet what she decides. That's hers." Nora drank the coffee. "But she'll have something to decide which she didn't have before." Paula nodded. The ER ran its afternoon around them. A pediatric intake at Bay 2, a phone call at the station, the elevator chime from the floor above, the normal accumulated movement of a building that ran on emergency and never stopped. "Dr. Finch is transferring," Paula said. Not with satisfaction, not without it, just stating it. "I heard. Day attending at a hospital in Eugene starts next month." She paused. "He's good, you know. As a physician, he's genuinely good." "I know," Nora said. "Good physicians who don't listen are a specific category of problem. The best kind to be if you have to be a problem because it's fixable." She set down the mug. "I hope he fixes it." She meant it. Competence in service of ego produced damage that was correctable. The alternative was worse. She met with Elkin at 3. He had prepared nothing for the meeting, which meant it was going to be a real conversation rather than an institutional one. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and looked at her and said, "I owe you more than a letter." "The letter was appropriate," she said. "It was sufficient. That's not the same." He paused. "I reviewed the 3 patient safety submissions after the fact. The diagram in the 3rd one, I should have flagged that when it came through. Risk management's 10-day turnaround protocol is a system I've accepted for years without examining whether it's adequate for time-sensitive safety concerns." "It's not adequate," she said. "For the record." "I know. I'm changing the protocol. Effective this month, structural safety concerns go to a rapid response committee with a 48-hour review window." He looked at her. "That's because of your submissions. I want you to know that." She nodded. That was what accountable looked like from the administrative end. Not dramatic, not self-flagellating, just the identification of a failure and the correction of the structure that allowed it. It was not satisfying in a narrative sense. It was satisfying in the way that functional things are satisfying, which was quieter and more durable. "I'm taking a position outside the hospital," she said. "A military training program, curriculum design. I'll be involved on a part-time basis, and I'd like to maintain a part-time clinical role here. ER, nights, and some days, a reduced schedule, if that's possible." Elkin looked at her. Possible and welcomed. "I'm not looking for a ceremony about it," she said. "I'd like to come back and do the work." "That's all we'd ask," he said. She shook his hand and left. Reinhold called her on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Washington, cleared for field status by a military physician who had confirmed Ferris's parameters and had apparently heard about Nora's insistence on the monitoring schedule, because he mentioned it in a tone that suggested the story had traveled. "Field cleared as of yesterday," he said. "I heard. Ferris told me." "Of course she told you." A pause. "How's the program?" Preliminary curriculum is drafted. Strauss wants a pilot cohort by the fourth quarter. We're working on the logistics. And Graves? She'd been waiting for that question because she'd known he'd ask it. It was the thread that had mattered to both of them in a way that was different from the operational pieces. Because it was the piece that was about what happened to the people. The structure failed before anyone was paying attention. She said yes, Nora said. She's going to have her disciplinary notation formally expunged. That's being processed through the review. And she's enrolled in an accelerated nursing program in Boise. She said she'd been thinking about it for 2 years and couldn't figure out how to make the application work without the reference she'd been denied. A pause. Someone from Strauss's office made some calls. Reinhold was quiet. She doesn't know my name, Nora said. I didn't ask for that. Why not? She thought about how to answer it honestly. Because it's not about that. The outcome is the thing. The recognition is secondary. She paused. It was always secondary. I just forgot that for a while. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you're a difficult person to do something for. You saved my job, she said. You kept being alive after I saved your life. We're even. He almost laughed. She could hear the careful restraint of someone with ribs that were still healing. That's not how accounting works. It's how mine does. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the morning. She thought about the thing that nobody talks about when they talk about being underestimated, which is that being underestimated is only partly about what other people think of you. The other part is what it does to you. How over time, if you're not careful, you start to build your life around the circumference of what you're willing to be seen doing. You stay on nights. You don't apply for expanded roles. You file the objections but don't push when they're ignored. You learn to make yourself useful in ways that don't require anyone to reckon with what you're actually capable of. She had done all of that. She had told herself it was strategy. Some of it was strategy. But some of it was something else. A slow accommodation to the idea that visibility was a risk she couldn't afford, and that the risk was about other people's reactions when, in fact, the greater cost was what she was forfeiting by not being seen. The people who had dismissed her were not the only ones who had underestimated her. She had underestimated herself. She had built a life specifically sized to what she'd been told she was allowed to occupy, and called that safety, and confused safety with wisdom. What she knew now, sitting at a kitchen table on a Saturday morning with a hot cup of coffee and a preliminary curriculum draft on her laptop and a part-time ER badge in her jacket pocket, was that the correct response to being dismissed was not to disappear. It was to stay, to do the work. To file the objection 3 times and mean it the 3rd time as much as the first. To make the call in the trauma bay and document it accurately. To say I'm in, without conditions when the moment required it. Not because justice was guaranteed, it wasn't. The structures that failed people failed them consistently and sometimes permanently, and the accounting was never clean. And Dessa Graves, working at a pharmacy counter in Boise for 2 years, was a fact that no subsequent correction could undo. But the response to imperfect odds was not to remove yourself from them. The response was to stay in the room, stay at the table, be exactly as qualified as you were and make that impossible to ignore, and then do it again and keep doing it, because the alternative, the long, slow accommodation to the idea that smaller was safer, cost more than it protected. It cost you the thing you came to give. She opened her laptop. The curriculum draft was on the screen, 17 pages, trauma protocols and gap analysis, and a framework for the formal review mechanism she'd insisted on building into the structure from the beginning. She read through the last section, made 3 corrections, and started on the next one. Outside the window, the sky was blue and not temporary. The day was ordinary and full of work, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She kept writing.